Hi, and welcome to the Product Rising podcast. Today's conversation is with a foundational architect of modern AI responsibility. Gennai founded and led Google's responsible innovation team, operationalizing Google's AI principles across one of the most influential technology companies in the world. In 2017, she co-authored Google's AI principles alongside a multidisciplinary group of experts, helping to define the company's commitments to fairness, privacy, safety, societal benefit, and accountability. Her background spans trust and safety, user research, and product fairness testing, and today she continues this work as a co-founder and partner of T3, advising organizations navigating the evolving ethical, regulatory, and societal landscape of AI. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you, Shannon. Great to be here.
We have so many things we could talk about today, so I want to start by framing the conversation around what you think is most urgent for us to get right when it comes to AI safety in this moment.
Right now, the key change is moving from AI as a tool, something that we can all use and helps us do our work better, to now AI being the actor and taking action. So this move from AI tool infrastructure models to AI agents and what that's going to look like. And that's fundamentally going to change how we govern it, what we think about responsibility, and also how we consider humans' role in that space. So with AI as a tool, we are the ones using it, we are the ones directing it, we're the ones validating what it does. With an agentic AI future, as it takes on more and more actions, it's going to be more and more complex about where humans get involved, and even if it makes sense that humans would get involved all throughout the life cycle, that traditionally I would advise for responsible AI is humans need to be involving themselves throughout the AI life cycle. That is fundamentally different with agents when they're making decisions, when they're taking actions without human involvement. So that's the biggest thing kind of keeping me up at night in the change of AI governance from historical best practices to now what does that look like in the future.
And going back to when you did start talking about this at Google in 2017, how would you say that things have changed now? I mean, I think there were probably things happening internally and externally that led to the creation of those original principles back then.
Yeah, well, one, it's hugely different now and then in terms of even where we are, that when we were starting to write the AI principles, there were no other principles essentially to pull from, that it was no roadmap of what does responsible AI, the principles, the policies, and the practice even look like. So we were one of the first companies to do that. And so not having that roadmap versus now, we have so many amazing frameworks being developed. I certainly recommend frameworks like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, ISO 42001 for a standard. And then we know that EU AI Act has already been developed in terms of what a regulatory framework looks like. So certainly where we are now versus where we were then is very different. And what did it look like at that time we started doing it? Certainly a lot of different moving pieces, and I was one of those moving pieces. That I started working on machine learning fairness back in 2014, and we didn't start writing the AI principles until 2017, and then we launched them publicly in 2018. So there are a couple of different factors, both internal and external, as you pointed out, that led to that. So for me, with ML fairness, one of the key external factors was driven by mistakes. And I'm a big champion of we should always learn from our mistakes so we don't repeat them. And the two biggest things that influenced me was, one, a paper by Dr. Latanya Sweeney of Harvard, where she looked at discrimination in online advertising in 2013. So she came out with a paper then, and that showed that Google ads were being shown in a potentially discriminatory way against Black sounding names. And she showed that there was a relationship there. So that stood out to me. And the second one that reinforced that was later with the Googles and Photos incident, when Black people were being labeled as gorillas because of issues in the modeling and the data set. So these two very bad situations influenced me to say, where is this happening? Is it systemic issues? How do we stop this from ever happening again? And how do we think more deeply about addressing these across the life cycle? So for me, it was these two external pressures. And then internally, I'd worked a lot on DEI efforts throughout the company, and was seeing how essentially online issues around bias and fairness manifest offline, but also the same issues that in real life, as we think about issues of bias and discrimination, all of that has been encoded into the algorithms online. And so it just gets reflected back to us. So that was kind of like how these two things came together for me. And back around that 2014, 2015, that I started making it part of my job and expanded that to then become part of this team that started writing the AI principles around 2017. So all of these things were happening kind of internally. And then 2018, when we published them, one of the key drivers there was a big issue that you and some of your listeners would probably have heard about, that there was a Maven incident, which was Department of Defense at that time and Google potentially working together, and a lot of Google people feeling that that was a betrayal of the company's values, and making that known. And so our principles, although they'd already been worked on for over 6 months, were seen as a reaction to Maven instead of what was the lived experience of the working group as we were designing these AI principles, was that we were trying to get ahead of exactly these types of issues that would raise ethical issues, as well as kind of practical governance and trustworthy AI questions. So a lot of different things. Certainly was not one thing that triggered the AI principles writing, but that's how it came about around that 2017, 2018 period.
Yes, and here we are today talking about very similar issues.
Yeah.
I think people have paid attention to the news in the last few weeks, and we're seeing that model companies are in a similar debate with the government of the United States at the moment as well. So, what do you think Google's role has been in setting some of those foundational ways to think about AI, and the role that humans should continue to play in terms of the relationship with this technology?
Yeah. So it's true that like Google and the role that myself and a lot of other people at that time were playing was to establish policies and principles that wouldn't just be used in big tech, but would be used and proliferate across the industry. So a key thing to consider is not just individual players in the market, but also how we're thinking about up-leveling the market. And that's what I consider part of my ongoing role, even at T3, is working with many different companies who may not have the same resources that I and other big tech companies had in terms of responsible AI full-time teams, ethicists, historians, people with backgrounds in civil rights. Most companies can't afford that level of expertise. And so I consider the obligation and responsibility of big tech to share what they've learned through full-time teams like the responsible AI, trust and safety teams, and share that externally, whether through standards bodies or international groups or even these cross-industry groups like Partnership on AI, in order that everyone gets to learn what does it mean to be responsible, what policies and practices work. So yes, it may have started in big tech, but these years later, as we are seeing, I forget the exact saying, but history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And that's what we're seeing now with the situation of Anthropic and Department of War, is determining when can technology be used appropriately within guardrails, and when does it risk being used in ways that many people may find inappropriate, uncomfortable, and it rubs up by questions of lawfulness of use of technology, and not when the law is so far behind the technology. So between the gap between how far the technology is advancing and where regulation and law is, we're making decisions in that gap. And so having to decide, does internal regulation, i.e. within big tech companies, still play a role, or is external regulation the only way to design those guardrails? And at Google at the time, we were defining internal regulation because none existed. Now we see with the EU AI Act, some regulation existed, but certainly not globally. And in the US, we're seeing a lack of federal law, with some states trying to fill that in. But that leads to its own issues around fragmentation.
Yeah, and actually, we are aware that the EU does have some regulation, but how would you describe their regulation simply for people to understand what exactly is going on at the moment?
So I'll just, because we've been talking about Google's AI principles for a while, I'll use that as a kind of counterpoint. So Google's internal regulations were a principles-based approach, that they are high-level principles. They're things that many people could interpret quite differently. And that was certainly one of the complaints and critiques we got with it, saying these are too high-level, to be fair, to be socially beneficial, to not cause harm. These are very big things. There's a lot of things that maybe could fall out of those buckets. But a principles-based approach is intentionally supposed to be flexible and allow for changes of norms, of regulations or interpretations of it to still say, well, fair, whether it's AI or generative AI, there may be different ways of getting there, but we believe in fairness. So principles-based approach allows for these kind of flexible definitions while still trying to be as future-proofed and large as possible. The EU AI Act, in contrast, is more a rules-based approach. So this is specific rules that companies must follow to achieve the regulation. So they're a lot more specific than principles. They're more defined, but it also means they're more brittle. So because the principles are a bit more flexible, they allow for kind of expanding definitions. A rules-based approach is specific to a rule, so you have to get those rules right from the start, or it's very easy to say the rule breaks in this particular situation. New technology falls outside a specific rule. So a rules-based is one of the key definitions of EU AI Act and how it's different than these principles-based approach. The other key consideration of the EU Act that I don't think gets enough attention from people who say it's too hard to follow the EU Act is that the risk-based approach allows for that flexibility in terms of if you're building or using AI that's more risky, that is more likely to have negative harms on individuals, on groups of people or society, you're held to a higher standard. And then if you're working on lower risk areas, maybe areas that don't have a material impact on people's lives, on their economic situation, on education, lower risk means lower obligations, and there's less that you need to do. And so the EU AI Act allows for more risk, then it means more responsibility, and you have to do more. Lower risk, lower obligations, you don't have to do as much. And I think that's the right way to think about it is the more harms, the more work you need to do to prove that it's not going to cause harm or that you've done enough to prevent that harm. So that's some of the key differences in understanding for the EU Act is yes, it's rule-based, but it's also risk-based to try and take a proportionate response to if this technology is more likely to cause harm, you need to do more to prove that it's not going to cause harm. And if it's not going to cause harm, how do you prove that and show that it's lower risk?
And I suppose in addition to the GDPR that they already have, we're talking about sort of a package of rules and regulations that people can follow there. So at least there's maybe a little bit more participation with regard to the way the companies engage in developing this technology than we have in the United States of America. What I've read, it does look like we're leaning toward understanding that we may need some regulations sooner than we had originally said that we would. Do you see any movement in that way?
I definitely see it at the state level, and I think that leads to two kind of aligned outcomes. So when we have a lot of movement at the state level, building on existing privacy laws and anti-discrimination laws, which align with existing online privacy and fairness obligations, regardless of technology. So whether it's normal hard-coded software or AI, we want to ensure these systems are not discriminatory and they're privacy protecting and secure. But with AI, the kind of additional principles or rules come up around things like interpretability and explainability, that we've heard this notion of AI as a black box. It's harder to understand how these systems make decisions and therefore how we're impacted and how we can fix issues if they occur than traditional ways of if this happens in the system, then this other thing happens. That's easy to understand the cause and effect. With AI, that's harder. So some of these state laws are trying to account for that how do we ensure explainability and transparency, but they're accounting for it in very different ways, which leads to this like notion essentially of fragmentation, that even if people are trying to do the right thing, if a company has to hit 50 different states' ways of defining transparency, that's bad for individual users or people in the market, because it means like, how do I trust that this is at the same level of transparency or something else? It can lead to confusion. It can lead to less trust in technology, even though the goal was to build trust and accountability into these technologies. So that fragmented approach, the different thresholds of acceptability, will be one of these issues of these state laws emerging. On the other hand, I'd say that as more and more state laws emerge, and this risk of fragmentation should lead to considerations around, would a federal law actually make more sense? That right now people are saying we can't have federal law because it'll slow down innovation. Well, 50 different states' versions of the law will also slow down innovation. So it could actually speed up and allow for greater innovation if there was greater clarity coming from the federal level. What does anti-discrimination mean? What does explainability mean? And the good news is the US federal government doesn't need to reinvent that from the start. Like I mentioned, there's already existing global standards that are based off of expertise from many different disciplines, many different regions, academic researchers, practitioners, already a lot of policymakers around things like the ISO 42001 standard. That's already a global standards organization that has been doing this for decades, setting standards that work for technology, and they work in a way that makes that technology trustworthy. So we already have that. And we also have the NIST AI risk management framework. That's a US organization itself that already defined how to manage risk. So being able to up level and consider that as an informative signal for what regulation could be, we already have so many of those pieces. So bringing them together, I think, would allow for greater innovation at greater speed, but yes, defined by the floor of regulation that I think is needed to prevent fragmentation and to ensure that people do trust this technology and therefore use it more.
Yeah, so I guess from what you're saying, it sounds like it's a better situation than maybe what we read about or what we can perceive from what's available in the media. There are a lot of people working together to try to come to some agreement about what the standards are. How do you feel about it? Do you feel optimistic that nations around the world will align?
I do have hope that given, again, I'll just use the EUA Act because that's already multiple countries coming together to define what's acceptable within the EU. And they're already expressing interest in making sure that that's a bit more accessible than it was originally designed. That they're already saying, oh, we might redefine what's in scope for some of these models, taking that risk-based approach and proportion approach. As we learn more and more use cases, we might be able to narrow what actually falls into scope. So it's not just that it's a strict regulation, it's one that is open to iteration depending on the market and experience and all of us as constituents saying what's working or not from a trustworthy perspective. Again, other nations aligning with that and saying, like GDPR, although obviously a European regulation, essentially became the floor for privacy elsewhere. Because if you're going to try and be a successful product in the EU, you have to meet the GDPR. Well, why not just do that globally then and make your product available? And that will be what I believe we'll see with AI is in order to operate in the EU market, you're already going to have to meet the obligations of the EU Act. So why not just make that your global approach? And other governments looking at that, they're like, okay, this is already a good way that's been defined to make AI trustworthy. Let's adopt that too. So I do have hope that globally there'll be more alignment of what good looks like in AI, but that also needs to be open to iteration because the technology is moving so quickly. We need our regulation to be a bit more responsive without being disruptive. We don't need our regulation changing every month as the technology changes. And that's why a risk-based proportion approach allows for a bit more flexibility on what's required and when, only when it's higher risk. And I think companies are also supportive of that. The higher risk it is, the more deliberate the decisions and operations around that need to be.
Okay. For many people, we don't actually know what all those categories of risk are. And it would be nice to see what those categories are that the world is really looking at.
Yeah.
Would it be possible to go quickly through? I think there's at least 7 categories of harm that you normally address. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's multiple categories of harm, and they're generally broken down. And again, this is one of these areas that thankfully there has been a lot of global alignment of what people agree harm can look like. So one we've talked about already is around bias and discrimination. So if these technologies do not consider everyone, they won't work as well for everyone. And that can manifest in many different ways. It could mean that we can't even use a product if it's not made for us. It may mean that harms are greater because we're not adequately considered in the technology. An example of this is as self-driving cars begin to proliferate, if not every type of person is considered, then maybe the cars and their sensors and technologies will not be able to identify them as human in appropriate ways. And then therefore reactions of these cars or even like inclusion of whether that would be considered safe or not may not be considered. So these do have real world implications when we talk about bias and discrimination. Other examples of that people know are more economic implications of bias and discrimination that as AI either advertises jobs or makes decisions on who is appropriate for those jobs, if it is only trained on historical trends, the types of people who previously got jobs are going to be the ones who will get those jobs in the future. So we have to be conscious that this can have an economic impact on what educational opportunities or working opportunities or financial credit access opportunities can all lead to material harm if they're not considered. So bias and discrimination is a big bucket. The second one, which is kind of more traditional, is the privacy and security bucket. That how private is our data when it's used to train these models? How secure is that data? How could nefarious actors get that data and either make either impersonations of us in this world of generative AI? The more information bad actors know about us, the more that they can come up with generated images of us or violate that in ways that impersonate us, again, for financial harm or otherwise. So that privacy and security, although a traditional software harm, is exacerbated with the speed and scale that these new technologies can advance. On the third side is this factuality, hallucination, accuracy questions around generative AI. That do we even trust what the AI is coming out with? We've seen examples of if you look something up in these AI models, it can make up a response. So how do we trust the technology, and how do we know that that won't cause misinformation harms, disinformation harms, us making decisions about medical issues when it turns out that that information is incorrect? So there's a lot of this real world harm that can happen with this hallucinations, inaccuracy of this. So that's a newer bucket that is less applicable to traditional technologies when we knew where the information came from and it was a more deterministic output of this comes from Y, and now we can trust it. And now the model is taking a more probabilistic approach of just like statistical predictions of what a next word can be. That means it's less reliable and can lead to real world harms. Then we get to bigger buckets of things like societal, environmental harm. Is it true that AI is using a lot more energy and water for coming up with responses? And it's true. We are seeing, as big tech is reporting out their energy usage, it is massively different than before. And that has led to them discussing things like restarting nuclear energy stations, trying to make their models more efficient and effective. But the impact of AI we're seeing in energy and water usage and the actual mitigations and prevention of that energy usage is years. So nuclear plants obviously take usually like decades to build and ensure that they're at an efficient rate, and trying to cut that down to like 5 years still means we're 5 years of usage of AI, energy and water from where we are today and what that will take. So there's definitely this mix of like real world short-term impacts. Bias happens every day. There's a risk of hallucinations, inaccuracies, violations of privacy and security, and then these larger scale misinformation, energy and environment, societal, and then the very large harms around things like economic disruption from a job loss perspective, and market concentration as more and more people are using big technologies, and all of these other harms that are more societal market. But every day we're all exposed to potential harms from that bias, privacy, and security perspective.
Yeah, I don't know if you have a area here that you think is most concerning, but from my standpoint, I feel like the latter category about societal impact, that's the one that seems to have the most question marks around it. What do you think is the one with the biggest gaps in knowledge at the moment?
I'll cheat by breaking my answer into two. So day to day, when I work with my clients, most of their questions are around how do I make sure that I can trust the outcome of this AI technology that me and my team are using? And so I spend a lot of time on accuracy, robustness, performance of these models, and fairness is part of that. Like you can't say that your model is performing correctly if it's excluding certain people, if it's damaging individuals. So where I spend most of my day to day is certainly on that performance, fairness, privacy, and security, and that's where my clients' kind of time and energy is spent. However, and from my time at Google and working with amazing philosophers and ethicists, I can't help but think about what this means at a human level. So when we think about what does it mean to be human, I'm not talking about AGI and AGI is going to take over like as a like sentient beast or anything like that at an AI level. I'm talking more about the job implications. What does it mean to be human, to not get up every day and choose to work? So certainly people will choose not to work. They already know what they'll do with their time. But as AI takes on more and more of these tasks and jobs that many people do, not everyone, I'm not also one of those people who's like, all humans will have nothing to do in X amount of time. I think it is going to fundamentally disrupt so many jobs and roles that many humans in a relatively short amount of time, probably not this year or next year, but within X amount of time. I'm not one of those people who will assign a specific time, but there will be a very short window when there'll be a huge disruption from AI and many people having to address the fact of like, what do I do now? What does it mean to be human? I know with my work in responsible AI now, and ML fairness, now that I've been doing it 10 years, my work has been my life. I am so passionate about building responsible technologies, making sure technologies work for everyone, that I need to do this. If I didn't have this to do, and if an AI, if you told me tomorrow, Shannon, that you've built an AI agent that solves responsibility and fairness, I'd wonder, what do I do now? What's left with me? Like, this is a very human problem. And for a human problem to be solved by AI, I think it will lead to many of us questioning what that means. So apologies for getting really philosophical here, but I think that they're really important questions that we need philosophers and people much more expert in the space than me thinking about what it means to be human. And like I said, many different people will find it great to have so much free time and choose what to do, but many people won't, and they'll struggle with understanding what their time is spent with. So that notion of kind of human actualization, human fulfillment, I think is a massive question that we need to move quicker on. And I would argue more policymakers need to be asking that question. They're not the questions policymakers ask me. Policymakers still ask me about how to specifically govern this model, how to hold big tech accountable, important questions, but as important as what do humans do in 10 years when all of this has disrupted many jobs and we don't have answers for that yet.
Okay, on that note, I'm curious. I mean, you hear all kinds of different opinions on exactly what you just said. Oh, it will create more new jobs and we can't foresee what they are yet. Okay, well, maybe that's true. But what kinds of skills should people focus on then? If, they're in their 20s, they're obviously going to be working for a long time. I mean, hopefully, what kinds of skills should people start to at least try to acquire and anticipate a future where things will be different?
Mhm. I'm a rule of three person, so I want to think of a third one, but the two ones that immediately come to mind are problem solving and communication skills. So what I mean by problem solving, I guess other people could call it strategic thinking or like being able to connect different concepts that as we try and like kind of predict this new world, we're only basing it on the parts that we know most personally or what we're being told. But there's a lot of unknowns here. So we need to be prepared to respond to the unknowns. And the best way of doing that is having to tackle many different problems in many different areas now and building the skills that one, build resilience, knowing that when a change happens, you can respond to it. So how to build resilience is working through different cases, working through different problems. Second is being able to be creative of what different solutions can be, not just being trained. And honestly, some critiques of traditional education are there is a test, there is an answer, you study to the test, you study to get the answer. And I think more and more the skill of there are many potential paths to a solution. Let's talk through them and let's start building the kind of synapses that allow us to think about different possibilities, whether it's about building creativity, getting better at scenario planning and horizon scanning, just building those skills to allow for many different ways of seeing the world. And third is still, I believe, analytics research skills tie into this problem solving. We know AI can do mathematical problem solving at a scale and speed that none of us, or many of us, cannot do off the top of our head. But it's about asking the right questions then, like what problem will AI solve? And part of that research and analytical skills, that skill set that I found so helpful in my career, is knowing which questions to ask. Not necessarily always having the answer to those questions, but getting more comfort on saying, wait, how much of this do we know? How do we pull different parts of information together? I think that skill will become more important. So kind of looping those three in terms of problem solving. And then the second one being communication, it's both tied into the first. So once we have these problems and key questions, how to communicate them both to other people, but also to AI as either prompting, vibe coding, whatever it's going to look like. I don't believe that there's a single path of how we will interact with these machines going forward. So it's going to be how do we communicate? And again, how do we be flexible with how to communicate with these machines, but also the very human problem of how do we communicate with each other? We're already seeing research that shows that communication skills, engagement skills have decreased both because of technology and after COVID lockdowns. And so relearning those skills of what it means to communicate with other human beings also allows for greater connection with human beings. I think having a healthy mind spirit is based on human connection. So we'll be able to be, again, more resilient with AI and machines when we've built communication skills. So communication, problem solving, I think, are the critical ones that any student, any adult should be either strengthening their muscle now or relearning how to address them. And I think that will build that resilience for any future that AI will go, which no one can predict now, despite how much we're being told that people see a path forward. No one can predict it. So I think they're going to be two of the most critical skills to navigate whatever this new AI future will look like.
Do you see in any of your client engagements or any places where you are speaking and engaging with organizations around the world, do you see that anyone is already doing that preparation and starting to refocus people? How are organizations already starting to shift it?
So I have to say, I'm not seeing it yet at organization level. Organizations here being defined as like corporate enterprises, commercial enterprises. So not yet. So many of them are dealing with the immediate need of being told, AI is everywhere. If you're not using it right now, you're falling behind, so use it. So that is a very natural response. Is most of the corporate people I'm working with are, how do I use AI right now and how do I see return on investment? And yes, some of those conversations go into, how do I take care of my employees, make sure that they're using AI to protect their job, to use it as a tool and augment themselves. In terms of who's actually thinking about this from a skill and kind of resilience perspective, there are definitely increasing conversations that I'm involved in and aware of, more like academic institutions. So certainly universities here in Silicon Valley, where I'm based, and all around the world, more questions around what does this look like and how do we build it into education. At a very local level, I know like teachers are already asking those questions because they are the coal face of who is interacting with students every day and saying, are these students going to be okay? And how do I be a bridge for them to this AI future? And what are the skills I need to teach them? So basically what I'm saying is, yes, there's lots of discussion and questions. There's not a lot of answers yet. And that's where I think, to my previous point, I do think policymakers should be playing a role to say, we need an answer by X date. It doesn't have to be a perfect answer, but we have to show that we're making progress and iterating and experimenting on answering the question of, how do we build these human skills? How do we reinforce that they're still important before it's too late? It's very hard to build a new skill versus strengthening a skill, which I more refer to strengthening a muscle we all have. Don't let that muscle atrophy. It's more like strengthening something that's already there, and that's easier now and not waiting until it's too late and we've kind of all forgotten how to interact with one another, problem solve. We've outsourced so much of our work to AI, and then we try and bring it back. That would be too late. So I do think we need to be moving from conversation and ideas now to implementation. And so my suggestion may perhaps be that these academic institutions work more directly with these corporate institutions to say, how are we training people? And then how do we train at an educational level to get ahead of this loss of like human skills and resilience? Anyway, very long answer to say there. No, I'm not seeing it certainly being implemented, but I'm encouraged by the conversations happening by way smarter people than me in academic institutions. We just need to connect those dots. How do we turn that research into policy and turn that research into practices in organizations?
Mm-hmm. If there's something that you could do as a leader in an organization right now, is there anything anybody can do to just start the organizational readiness?
Well, one of the most important leadership skills is building psychological safety. So it's a more cultural thing than a technical thing. If people feel safe in your organization, they can raise questions around, again, whether it's we're being told to use AI. I don't trust the AI, so I haven't used it. If you help us trust technology, we'll make both this business better, we'll feel more included and heard, and that starts a really positive cycle. So it's psychological safety. It's not just good for the employee, it does lead to better business outcomes. It also will help from a like psychological safety perspective if people can raise their hand and say something is going wrong with the technology. So it shouldn't get to the stage of needing like whistleblower protection. It should be, hey, I've noticed that this AI is actually coming out with these like bad outcomes or potentially causing harm. I'm going to raise my hand and be able to flag that. And a leader that has psychological safety would encourage that. So it stops small issues from manifesting into much bigger ones. If you don't have psychological safety, people will not report. It insidiously spreads throughout a system until it's then seen by either society or customers or someone externally. So building that psychological safety is important right now for even these other areas, and will allow for building resilience as employees get more and more concerned about their jobs. If they trust their leader to be able to say, what do I need to be doing in order to either protect my job, or I see my job changing, like, are we in this together, or am I being replaced, or am I going to change with my job and just consider different roles, expanding scope or something like that? And if your leader is not building psychological safety, that's unsaid. People feel fearful. They stop using AI. They might look for other jobs, even if they're a high performer. So there's many different things that psychological safety, if I had one of those key skills that a senior leader should do, can allow for both kind of business, technical, and personal positive outcomes if it's there, and leads to a lot of harm, a lot of negative things happening without being unknown until it's too late if it's not there.
Okay, and I hear you. I think that sounds very challenging in the environment where you may not have much of a say about whether a company wants to grow or shrink its headcount. But I mean, I think what you're saying there is, though, you can, on an individual level, create a culture within your team where at least they're upskilling and maybe they're thinking about how they can apply their expertise in some other job, even if it's a different company. Is that the type of thing that you might be able to do?
Yeah, and that's also part of what I help some of my clients do, is some of that organizational design and preparing both themselves, their team, and their technologies for that organizational design. So yes, team members, like, sometimes just by the course of business, not all of those jobs get to be changed to be more higher value jobs. Some of them will require simply less work in this particular domain, so that won't work out for everybody. But transparency, still kind of showing up as a leader, saying, this is the reason this happens, still allows people to take a bit of control. And then, yes, that should tie in with ongoing training, education. Like, these are transferable skills that if you provide that to your staff, even if as a senior leader you don't know all the outcomes, you've at least given people transferable skills and they know that you tried to help them. And I still think that can lead to good outcomes and less negativity and culture drain than if you hadn't provided this at all. So yeah, seeing education and skills training, especially transferable skills, allowing people to learn AI not just for their specific jobs, but yes, in different situations, and providing different tools available to them, but also allowing for essentially the sharing culture, so people do feel like AI is not something to be scared about, regardless of the outcome, but that they're developing these skills as AI is a tool, not AI as a replacement, even if some of the outcomes may be that people feeling more autonomy and control generally leads to better outcomes. So managers can certainly provide that as more hard skills versus just the soft skills of psychological safety. We want both. We want services, training, education to improve, not just here's a safe space without the skills and training aligned with that.
Yeah, and I think, there are a lot of positives to using AI if you use it on an individual basis. So you can't deny that it makes a lot of these things that were previously busy work that takes hours and hours much, much easier. What do you think is one of the most promising capabilities of AI to transform organizations in a positive way that everybody can get behind? Like, we want to give some cheer and optimism to people who are always seeing it through the lens of layoffs and things like that. There are other ways to look at it, right? What do you think could help people change their perspectives so that they feel a little bit more in control?
Yeah. So what I tell my clients when they say, "Hey, we've said that we are an AI first company, but we're not getting this uptake. Our employees are resistant. Why is that? Like, we're trying to lead from the top and be clear about our goals, and our goal is to be AI first." And there's so many packed into that, both the, kind of how it's said and what's expected. So one is AI first means the technology comes first in this business's prioritization or lead, and so that leads to a question of, well, where do humans come? If AI is first, does that mean humans are last? Does that mean me as an employee is last, or am I second? And how do I think about that? So language and how we frame this encouragement of AI is one thing. Second thing is the actual usefulness of it to the individual, not just to the business. People saying AI is going to solve this business problem, especially if words like efficiency is used. People like the connotations with efficiency is job loss, cost savings. That efficiency can be scary. So instead, it's about getting rid of repetitive and painful tasks on people's plates. And so where we've seen that with our clients, repetitive tasks are differ obviously by functions and roles. I work a lot with people in either financial services and legal and big tech. So certainly what repetitive is different for different people in different functions. But starting with that, saying, what's the part of your job that you don't like doing? Let's spend some time saying how to use AI to solve that. And then worry more about what's the repercussions on the team and then kind of organizational goals. Sometimes I hear the opposite, which is from managers saying that person is only solving their own problem. They're not thinking about the team. And I was like, no, encourage that. Be like, yes, okay, you've addressed your problem. How can you help like us address our team problem? More like that positive reinforcement as showing people it's good for you, how it can be good for your team and your organization instead the other way around. Because when it's business first, then team, then you, then people are less encouraged to actually solve those problems. So the efficiency and repetitive tasks can be anything from the easiest place we start people are like summarization of documents using AI just for initial small projects tied to someone's like particular OKRs or goals that they have and tying that to what's the time saved. And many people struggle with that because they're like, I'm still busy. It means that AI didn't save any time. That's not really what happened. When we break it down, and external research has shown this too, that you're spending your time on different things. So it has had an impact, but people aren't measuring it correctly to say, well, I'm still busy, which means AI hasn't saved any time, when it's actually, oh, I'm spending less time on my emails, less time on creating a presentation, and more time on the research, more time defining the actual problem statement and decisions that need to be made. That's a better use of your time. So we need to be better at defining what good looks like, defining what kind of time savings and work done is. And that we've seen like a lot of positive benefit of like repetitive tasks, the boring tasks. We've definitely seen positive engagement there. I just think we're not very good at describing that yet. And that's why I do work with managers and execs to define better what their goals are at a team and individual level so people see the benefits of AI. So certainly there's a lot there, but I think it gets lost in the noise if people feel, well, we haven't automated everything and we're still busy, but there's so many things you've changed your time spent on, and that's still a good change.
Yeah, and it brings up an interesting point is that we all think about how AI is going to affect our jobs and our industries, but it's also affecting the way people have to lead. They have to spend some time thinking about the way they're framing the conversation and the way they're messaging in this and the way they're training their employees. So that's an interesting illumination here in this conversation is there's a lot of your time. It sounds like that you're spending on helping train the leaders for this future. Yeah.
Yes, I have to admit that people think AI is a tech problem to be solved. And what I'm seeing more often, it is a cultural and tech problem to be addressed. You're not going to solve everything, like you don't solve all human issues. You're not going to solve everything with AI. So it's being more deliberate about what are the organizational challenges we have adopting AI? What are the organizational goals we want to use AI for? And then where are people's concerns and resistance in order to bring those two things together? And so I end up, even if I'm kind of immediately brought in to solve a technical problem, make it more responsible, or at least increase usage, end up kind of working with more senior leaders to say, how are you framing it? What are the overall goals and how do you bring your organization together with you? That will lead to more AI usage, more AI benefit, but it's the way you do it that's going to like show that return on investment and ensure that you're using AI kind of more broadly and more effectively. But it starts with a bit more human diagnosis versus technology and infrastructure diagnosis.
Oh, that's fascinating. Is there any place you could recommend where people can read more about that? Like, is there, a Substack or a book?
So I love this question because I know also that people get overwhelmed by the amount of information that is being shared with them or that they're reading online. So even for my own best practices that I try and follow the people I trust on LinkedIn. The people that I follow there are able to provide kind of distilled summary of either papers or news stories that help me understand where to spend my time. So I'm on LinkedIn, but you can also find the people I follow on LinkedIn there. I definitely still kind of do traditional because my clients use Harvard Business Review, MIT Technology Review. These are really good commercial relevant articles that I find are also good at addressing what are emerging issues in a practical way. And in terms of normal like news media, books or otherwise, technology moves so quickly. It can be hard for non-technical people to stay up to date. And so I caution about like either books can be very out of date very quickly. Or in news media, if journalists are not trained in technology, they may not be taking or understanding the nuance of launches, and they get very caught up with, well, here's what this big tech leader is saying, and we're going to swirl around that. I generally caution my clients that big headlines, whether it's from big tech or from large journalist sources, they're generally about hype. And I'd probably say that's a distraction. Many times when big tech is talking about, here's either the big scary thing that technology could do, or here's the amazing thing we're launches, you just have to ask, like, well, follow the money. Like, what do they want you buying? Is it that they want you buying their technology, not someone else's technology? And so usually a lot of this is marketing, hype and PR. So I actually kind of advise people, don't get distracted by the day-to-day headings on AI. Follow voices that you trust.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I think this has been incredibly helpful. I learned so much. Thank you so much for being here today. This has been really enlightening for me and for our listeners as well.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Great conversation. Lots of good questions there for both now and as we prepare for the future. So appreciate the opportunity to speak on it.
Thank you.
This podcast is an original production of Women in Product. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the Women in Product YouTube channel. Leave us a review so that others can discover us, or share this episode with someone you know. Original music provided by Gennai. Thanks for joining.